I'm Agnes Callard. Welcome to Night Owls. So we're going to get started in just a minute. Just like 3 quick announcements. One, Robin and I are going to talk for about like 40, 45 minutes. And then we'll have a break. And then there's going to be cookies and hot chocolate. You've already done your good service by buying some of our bake sale goods, but this one that's coming will be free. And then we'll have the Q&A till around 11:30, okay? But you can leave at any time, okay? This is not a class. You can also come back at any time. If you want to leave for a little while, come back, up to you. We have one more, this has been a very Night Owls quarter, and we have one more event, which is a week from this Saturday, on February 18th, at Doc Films. We're doing an event on the movie Banshees of Inisherin, in which I will be talking to my husband, Arnold Brooks, about it. So please come to that as well. I don't think I need to say anything else. Okay, let's get started. I've been like kind of a public intellectual for maybe, 6 or 7 years. And, before that, I was just a regular old private intellectual academic type. I wasn't running the undergraduate program. I didn't meet all these people from different fields. Anyway, but since then, it's been really nice because I meet lots and lots of different people in different fields, whereas I used to just talk to philosophers. Now I talk to non-philosophers. And it's great to meet all those people. But of all of the people that I've met and talked to, and on Twitter, in lots of different formats, this is the most interesting one. So that's why I started to have a podcast with him so I could talk to him more. Part of why Robin is so interesting is that he is so weird. And he has a weird angle on everything. And it always seems just really wrong to me. And for me, that's exciting. I hope it will be exciting for you, too. Let me say who he is. This is Robin Hanson. He is an economist and many other things, and he teaches at George Mason University. Okay, so we're going to talk about the sacred, and some of you have a handout and some of you don't. If you don't, you could try to sidle up to somebody who does, but it's not that essential. You have one here. Can you put it between us? Okay. I want to I just want to start by listing a bunch of things that you list as sacred. Family, love, honesty, liberty, school, art, music, fiction, innovation, inquiry, religion, spirits, sky, space, nature, sport, talk, friendship, health, medicine, children, democracy, law, war, royalty, and nation. That's a whole bunch of sacred things. And so this event is about what do they have in common, and what is the function of having this category of sacred. So maybe, Robin, I'm just going to let you talk for a minute and explain where you've gotten to in your research on this question.
Hello, everyone. I'm a bit anxious about this because usually I'm just really well prepared on a topic like this, which I come to prepare with years of working up together. And this is a topic I started on 6 months ago. And basically, one thing I do a lot is try to imagine how the world could be different in institutional ways. And one of the things that just keeps getting in my way is the sacred. And I finally said, I'm going to figure this thing out. So I'm relatively senior in my career, and I just get more and more ambitious at taking on bigger problems. And you might think, come on, that's crazy big, Robin. That's too big. Back down and stay in your lane. And that's not me. So I decided to sort of just tackle this head on. So the straightforward way I've learned to try to understand strange social phenomena is first collect data and then theorize. So this list you have in front of you is my attempt to collect the data. That is, I read a bunch of different...
Should you lower the mic?
Up, like this. Louder. Okay.
Am I audible? I'm good.
Okay.
Okay, so just...
All right.
So maybe just be closer to
All
it
right,
so that you're
be
louder.
closer to the mic.
Is that good if he's that
Can you
close to
hear
it?
now? Is it off?
Maybe his mic is not on.
I thought they said these mics were on.
You know what?
Here's a different mic. Is this one on? Hello? No? No? That mic
No.
isn't on? Hello?
You know, we
Hello?
had this
Hello?
problem last
No
time we were
mics.
here.
Okay.
In that case, I think you should sit here, Robin. Sit here and do this one, and I'll just be really loud. I have that.
Can you hear now? All
Yeah,
right.
That's much better.
I see. It's got a little green light. Maybe that you need
Yeah, this
the
one
green.
doesn't have a
That
green
needs
light.
the green light.
I'll mess with it while you talk.
Okay, sorry. All right, so it's a very simple method. You collect a bunch of correlates, a bunch of sort of patterns in social data, patterns in how people behave that aren't obvious patterns, that they're sort of like you wouldn't have expected that necessarily. It's not crazy wrong, but it's a little surprising. And that's what this list is, 47 correlates of the sacred. And once you've got a set of correlates, a set of data, then the next thing to do is find some theories to apply to the data. That is, ask what theories could explain this. And these correlates, I think, fall into 7 categories, which I'll just say near at the top you can read off. Sacred things are seen as valuable, especially valuable, or especially unvaluable. We show that we value the sacred. That is, we want to sacrifice and do other things, and we have emotional reactions, all as ways to show that we value the sacred. It tends to unify us, that groups are often unified together around their shared concept of the sacred. The sacred is set apart, discreetly distinguished in a separate category from mundane, ordinary things, so that we even dislike having money associated with it, making trade-offs, other ways we just don't want it mixed up with non-sacred things. It's idealized in the sense that it has fewer defects, is simplified, more potent, made more potent, it has fewer limitations. Second to last, we have a norm that we're supposed to feel more the sacred and less think it. We're less supposed to be calculating and deliberately, figuring things out. You're just not supposed to be using numbers. You're supposed to be using emotions. And the last category is that many kinds of sacred things that she listed are kind of abstract, like democracy, and that often when we find a concrete thing, like an object or a day or a person associated with that, it becomes sacred by association, and that we especially value those associations. So, for example, love might be sacred, and a concrete love letter might be an icon of the love that you especially value. It lets you connect to the love. So those are the 7 correlates of the sacred. And then I take the intellectual challenge, find a way to make sense of these 7 correlates, find a theory that can explain them all together. And that's something I've done a lot as a social scientist, try to take sets of things better. And the place I've started is with this guy named Emil Durkheim, who was the founder of the field of sociology. He wrote a book on religion in 1912. And he basically said the basic element of religion was the sacred, and that the basis of the sacred was that the sacred united groups together around a shared thing they valued, and so that's where I started. And that one, right from the start, will explain the first 3 things. That is, if groups are uniting together around the sacred, a sacred thing so that they can bind together by seeing the sacred the same way, then they would naturally want to actually value that thing and show each other that they value it so that they can see that they are, in fact, bound together by the sacred. It's the other 4 correlates that were a little more challenging. How can we understand why the sacred would be set apart, idealized, feel, not think, and sort of created by touching? And my explanation for that invokes something called construal level theory, which is a theory in psychology that says that we our minds are organized by levels of abstraction, and abstraction versus concreteness is a central element of how our minds are organized, and so we think differently about things that we think concretely versus abstractly about, and that when we see a few things up close, like I'm seeing the mic or the water or the paper, we see those in a near mode, which is more concrete, and when I see many small things far away, like your faces, those are seen in a far mode that's seen more abstractly because each thing has fewer descriptors, and that's just a fundamental difference in how we think. And it makes a big difference whether we see something up close in near mode or far away. And it's not just spatial distance, but it's also time distance, social distance, chance distance, that is unlikely things are farther away, and planning distance, that is high-level goals are farther away and concrete. And you can see now the distance effect is an obstacle to seeing things the same in a group. So in our society, we tend to see medicine as sacred. But there's a problem. If you have a medical issue right now, you see that in near mode, and I see your medical treatment from way over here or months away, and I see it in far mode, and we won't see it the same. We will see them differently, and that's an obstacle to groups seeing it together. And so the key hypothesis that I offer to put all these things together that we can discuss is the idea that usually we see things up close in near mode and things far away in far mode, but for the sacred, we make an effort to see them both in far mode, even when they're close. And if we do that, then we will see it more the same, and then as a group we can unify together more smoothly by seeing things the same, and that hypothesis predicts these four correlates. We can go into details, but like an intuition might be, think of sex versus love. Sex is relatively unsacred. It gets sacred when it's connected to love. And we usually see sex in near mode if we're involved in it, or in far mode if we aren't, and those people disagree often about sex. If you're in the moment there, you just see it different. Love we see as more sacred, and love we tend to all see as if from a distance, so that even if you're in a relationship for a long time, if I ask you, are you in love, you often aren't sure what to say. And there's this famous Joni Mitchell song about, what's the name?
Both
Sides Now, yes.
Now.
Both Sides Now, where she says, I've seen love from both sides now, and I really don't know what it is. And you go, you've been in love all your life. This is a song about love. You don't know what it is, but that's what the sacred does to something you see from far away, even when it's close. And that would be the general idea. And this habit of seeing it from far away, even when it's close, also gives it sort of its otherworldly, transcendent feeling, that it doesn't feel the same way it does to see something up close, because you are, in essence, being transcended while you see it. So I feel that's enough time to give you a quick summary, and we can go into whichever direction you want.
Good. So first I want to ask a few questions about near mode and far mode. So do non-human animals also see things sometimes in near mode and sometimes in far mode?
I don't know of any data, but I would guess so.
Okay. But you might think maybe one might hypothesize that something that non-human animals don't do is like have the power to see things in far mode even though they're near. I find it hard to imagine that an animal could do that, a non-human animal could do that.
I don't know.
So abstraction, like the power of abstraction, like what we use for math, that seems like far mode?
So math is abstract, but in a slightly different sense of the word abstract than far mode is abstract. So the literal meaning of abstraction is with little detail. So literally,
it doesn't literally mean that. I mean etymologically. It just means drawn away.
When you drop detail from a description, it becomes more abstract in the sense that there's less there to work with. And often when we reason abstractly, what we do is we reason by ignoring some of the detail that we decide is not relevant for our analysis.
Right.
So that's a sense of abstraction that is the far mode kind of abstraction. The key idea is like when I see your face far away in the back of the room, my mind represents it with relatively few details. There's a color, there's roughly a shape, maybe an elevation, And my mind just doesn't have that many details to describe about it, and so it's going to reason based on the few high-level descriptors that it has, and that's the kind of abstraction that far mode has. Math abstractions tend to be pretty precise, and you can just make all this powerful reasoning with math through these abstractions that are really much more precise than the abstraction that you use in far mode. Your far mode abstractions are kind of fuzzy.
But I mean, if I just added up, here's three things, 1, 2, 3, in order to add them together mathematically, I have to abstract from like this one is a cup and this one is, and this one's over here and this one's over here. So it seems like in mathematizing the world around us, we do ignore details.
Right, so the kind of abstraction your mind does automatically, but when it looks far away, just isn't a mathematical kind of abstraction. And an amazing fact is we discovered math. We found a way to have abstractions that you could reason about precisely, and that was a very powerful thing, and that's not what your brain is doing when it's looking at something in far mode. So it's a related kind of abstraction, but the kind of mental processes your mind is doing in far mode is just not math.
So take a philosophy thought experiment, like a trolley problem or something. And then, so when you pose such problem to students, there are always some students who try to kind of get out of it by making it a little too real. They're like, well, I would run away, or I would find a way to rewire the trolley, or right? And you're like, no, you're supposed to be abstracting from all of those things. That is, they're sort of imagining it a little bit too much in near mode. That might be one way that I would put it, but but it is abstract reasoning. I guess I'm not seeing why one couldn't combine precise abstract reasoning with far mode.
You can combine them to some degree, but the point is philosophers and mathematicians have gotten enormous power out of these precise kinds of abstractions that our brains weren't built to automatically do. So when you reason on far mode, you can take thousands of things and reason about them all in parallel very quickly and intuitively because your mind is just doing each one. But when we do mathematics or philosophy, we tend to do it serially, step by step, carefully, and our minds are really only capable of doing mathematical or philosophical abstraction sequentially and carefully, and that shows how different capacity of your brain you're using.
But is the thought that this power to reason in far mode about something that is close, to like switch to far mode, that is something our brains evolved to do, or something we learn to do with them? Like, why couldn't it be something we learn to do with them just as we learn to do math or philosophy with our brains?
I'm not making a claim about the process by which the sacred appeared. So it could be deeply biological, or it could be pretty cultural. That is, we don't really know how far in the past it arose. And maybe it only arose 20,000 years ago, maybe it arose 200,000 years ago. I don't know. And so that's why I'm trying to be non-committal about where exactly it evolved, and therefore sort of at what level in the brain it changed. I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. So let me, I want to read you some quotes from Durkheim and see what you think. Durkheim says, it is an essential postulate of sociology, this field that he's somewhat the founder of, that no human institution can rest on an error or a lie. If an institution is not based on the nature of things, it encounters a resistance in nature which destroys it. The very existence of primitive religions, therefore, assures us that they hold to reality and express it. Here's another quote. It is simply inconceivable, therefore, that religions which have held so considerable place in history, and to which in all times men have to receive the energy which they... To which seems weird there, okay. To which in all times men have to receive the energy which they must have to live, should be made up of a tissue of illusions. So that's Durkheim saying we have to see the truth in religion. I wonder whether you agree with that, because in your paper at one point you said, in order to study the sacred, we must to some degree defy it. And I'm not sure Durkheim agrees about that.
So Durkheim says directly and explicitly that the power of the sacred is the power of the community, but that we won't see it that way, and we instead project the power of the community into these other things we treat as sacred, like a tree or a bird or other things like that, and so that we are somewhat in denial about the nature of the power that animates us and that unites us, but according to that quote, there has to be a power for it to be able to do such. So the essence of that quote I very much agree with, which is the idea, as a social scientist, if there's some big area of life where people spend a lot of time and energy, there's something going on there. There's something they're getting out of it, some equilibrium they're in, whereas if they deviated, they would be substantially worse off. That's the way we understand social behavior. So there must be powers there must be energy there must be a source of something they value such that they are driven to act in that area. So I would say the same about sport or art or other sorts of things, that if lots of people are doing it, I don't think we want to explain that in terms of some just silly, stupid mistake they're making. They're confusing A for B or something like that. That's not a very good social explanation for millions of people spending large fractions of their time doing something. What they're doing might not be what they think they're doing, and that's what Durkheim says is true about religion. They are not quite aware exactly what they're doing, but he says there's got to be a reality there, a real force, some energy, some source of value that is the reason why they're doing a lot of it.
So, I mean, you attribute that reason as social cohesion. That's one way that you put it. And I'm not sure Durkheim completely agrees with you on that. That is, it depends on what you mean by social cohesion. So I wanted you to sort of say a little bit more about what is social cohesion? Why is it so valuable? Why do we put all this effort into construing things as sacred in order to achieve social cohesion?
The superpower of humans, to a large degree, is our ability to interact and coordinate on much larger scales than other animals do. Most animal species that are substantially intelligent have groups of the size of a dozen or 2 dozen, and they can't coordinate on larger scales than that. Humans are able to coordinate on far larger scales, and the reason we can coordinate is not just that we have language and tools, but that we have these kinds of social connections that we can build on. And so if you think about what does it take for groups of people to coordinate on larger scales, then you can start to see the power that Durkheim is thinking of.
So, like, here's what I read into Durkheim there, as it's like not so much that we always want to be coordinating on larger and larger scales, but that there's something about human motivation that social coordination speaks to. So, like, here's a quote on that. "The believer who has communicated with his God is not merely a man who sees new truths of which the unbeliever is ignorant. He is a man who is stronger. He feels within him more force either to endure the trials of existence or to conquer them." And Durkheim also discusses that, like, just the strongest motivations and feelings and passions of human life come from the sacred. Impressions of joy, of interior peace, of serenity, of enthusiasm, which he even says these are the proofs, for a believer, these are the proofs of their belief, that they are motivated, that the non-believer is just listless, demotivated, doesn't really care much beyond what's in front of his nose, and just can't achieve anything great. Like, that Durkheim thinks we have a magic source of motivation in our connection to other people. It's not so much that we can, if there are many of us, more easily fight off a predator or something. It's somehow, if there are many of us, we, like, channel some magical energy that infuses us.
So in order to get us to cooperate and work together, evolution had to motivate us. Motivations are the tools that evolution uses to get us to do the behavior that it wants us to do. So the question is, how does it structure our motivations to get us to do the things that are in our interest to do, or at least in evolution's interest to do? So think of domestication. We domesticate animals, often by being at the top of their social hierarchy, and it's standardly seen that humans domesticated humans as much as they domesticated other animals. We are a self-domesticated species, And this means we are basically submitting to and obeying other humans as often as other domesticated animals obey humans. But there's a striking fact about people's conformity and sociality, which is most people deny that they care much what other people think or that they submit much to social pressure. People basically flat out say that they aren't conformist, that they won't submit to conformity pressures, and they won't do what other people say. Now, you might wonder why that would be, but apparently we're pretty proud creatures. So it seems the fix evolution had here, social evolution or biological, I'm not sure, was to unite us not around obeying and submitting to each other's social pressure, but picking another object, a tree, and having us all so obsessed with that tree together that we together then bonded together and were motivated to really like each other, all the other people who like that tree. And then that's the strong bonding motivation sense of energy that makes us then do things together with all the other people who share our sacred tree. And then we don't have to admit that we are submitting to social pressure or conformity pressure or agreeing with other people because they want us to. We can instead focus on this other object, this outside object, as in our mind, the motivation. And Durkheim basically says what I'm saying, I think, pretty directly at several points.
Okay, so let's go to the soul. The soul doesn't show up on your list, but it actually is a very classic sacred, like body versus soul, right? Soul is sacred. So, like, you know, Durkheim's understanding of the belief in the immortality of the soul is that the soul is like the individual's representative of the group. So it's like I have in me, like I don't have in me an Agnes soul. I have like a human soul, or maybe if the group has some totemic animal or something, it could be like a dog soul or whatever, right? But the point is that my soul isn't personalized. It actually, I once, when I was an undergrad here, I complained about this to one of my professors. I was taking a class, I believe, on the Phaedo, and I was like, well, you know, yeah, maybe like my soul is like immortal, but I mean, it's not really me. And he said to me, Ms. Gellin, my last name was Gellin then, Ms. Gellin, do you require that your immortal soul have your name written in the corner? And I was like, yeah, kind of. That's kind of what I want. But in any case, that's not the idea of the immortality of the soul. The idea of the immortality of the soul is that there's a kind of type, that each of us is also a type. And then the thought is that the immortality of the soul is a way for people to represent to themselves the idea that the community continues after we die. Because there's something about us that is that communal self, right? That is going to the society will post-exist my death. In that sense, my soul will continue to live because my soul is the society in me, okay? And I guess when I hear that kind of analysis, it just seems to me that Durkheim is saying that the group is sort of bonded on a deeper level than, oh, well, we picked an object to coordinate around to solve these, dominance issues because we couldn't coordinate in the simpler way or something. That there isn't some simpler way that we could have coordinated. That this is like, at least from Durkheim's point of view, a kind of massive intellectual achievement that we can abstractify our group into like this entity, and then each of us think we have one of those in us, and then thereby think, in a way, I can't die because I am this group.
So over the last century, there's been this enormous trend away from religion, and Durkheim was primarily writing about religion, but now we are much less religious, but we have a lot of sacred. And so I chose this list trying to take that into account, trying to describe it in terms that would apply to religion or not religion, so that we can be studying the nature of the sacred in general, whether or not it has a religious direction. And so much of today's discussion of the sacred in the like democracy, medicine, love, things like that, they don't really talk about the soul much in those contexts. And so that's why I wasn't emphasizing the soul in this analysis. But let's make it a little more vivid, though, in terms of the motivation. That is, in our society, say, love is sacred, and we each see love as a thing that we highly value, and we feel a deep connection to love, and that we identify with it. And then if we meet someone who doesn't respect love that much, there's a bit of a repulsion and a bit of an alienness that we have with them, because this is essential to us. We have identified with it. It's become part of our identity. And so this is what bonds us to the other people who see love as sacred, is they don't repel us. Similarly, if we see medicine as sacred and we meet someone who isn't really into medicine and they don't respect it very much, and if medicine is very sacred to us, then that's a big obstacle to us getting close to those people and trusting them, because they just seem alien and untrustworthy, because this thing that's so obviously important and precious to us, they don't get it. And so that would be the mechanism by which we are bonded together, not just that we chose something arbitrary. In our minds, it's not arbitrary. It's something we deeply value.
So the thing that you said about how we're repulsed by somebody who doesn't believe in love, but like in actually like most romantic comedies, there'll be like, the ideal is like somebody who doesn't believe in love, but then when they meet the right person,
Yes.
Everything turns around. And so they have the analog of what you might call like a personal ecstatic experience, like an ecstatic, people have ecstatic religious experiences, right? But we have this notion of an ecstatic romantic experience where it's actually ideal if you did not believe in love going into the romantic experience, because it's supposed to be powerful enough to turn you around. So what in the theory of the sacred explains the value we place on these personal ecstatic experiences?
Well, if you're part of a group of people you identify with, and then there's some other people around, if they were permanently unable to see your thing, they would be more alien and enemy even. If they just haven't seen it yet, now you can hope that they will come to join you by seeing the value of the sacred thing that you see, and you can have converted and brought them into your group, and that can be a very comforting feeling and an even stronger attachment. That because if you just grew up valuing love, that's not going to be as clear a signal that you value love than if you previously denied valuing love and then were forced to change your mind and admit it.
Okay, good, but I actually think we can do one better than converted, because in a lot of these cases, it's actually really pretty important that no one like persuades the person into either the religious, insight or the romantic one, that it's a personal ecstatic experience that's held individually. And it could be that the importance that we place on that, it's almost to say, well, this isn't just social bonding, right? That is, you can perceive God, you can connect to God, you can do it in some sense outside of the group, right? And then it would almost be like a validation of the non-arbitrariness of the particular sacred thing.
Yeah, I think, so if you think about the sacred abstractly, very academically, it's just this curiosity of, people have these weird behaviors, maybe if you're not feeling it at the moment. But when you feel the sacred, I mean, one of the most obvious, dramatic things that just even seems hard to explain is that previously you had relatively modest motivation and energy, and then when you see the sacred, suddenly your energy and motivation just go through the roof. Suddenly there's just you feel huge value here. And that even feels supernatural. It feels like this couldn't just be ordinary, mundane things that could possibly make me feel so strongly and motivated and make me feel the sense of awe, and that I'm close to something powerful and huge and central that matters. That strong emotional sense is really persuasive. And it makes you attached to that thing and loyal to it from then on, and then loyal to the other people who are connected with you. And say love is like that. Love, when you first feel love, it's this very powerful thing that's beyond what you expected to feel before, and it feels overwhelmingly stronger than all the other things you were feeling recently nearby, and you think, this can't be just physics or biology. There is something supernatural here even.
So you've written, if something must be sacred, let it be math. So can you just say a little for us about why you want math to be the sacred, and what do you think would be some advantages and some disadvantages of the sacralization of math? Math is already a little bit sacred, but you want it to be even more sacred. So talk to us about that.
Okay, so the sacred is powerful, and it greatly changes how we deal with things and see them, and that has costs. So on the plus side, seeing something as sacred will bind you to other people who see it the same, and it will motivate you more to put more energy into that thing. Those are pluses. The minuses are that your view of it gets distorted. You're not willing to just think about it and calculate it. You're not willing to make trade-offs between it and other things. You're not willing to attend to its details. And so, for example, I think because we treat medicine as sacred, we don't do it very well. Most people pretty much trust their doctor without thinking very much skeptically about whether they should. And so we actually have less health because we treat medicine so sacredly. So then the question is, okay, well, it seems like we need to treat something as sacred. It's just a deep desire to have some things that we treat as sacred. So then the question is, well, which things should those be? And then the criteria would be, well, on the one hand, which things do we want more energy into? Say, innovation, I would say is very important. Which things do we need to bond with other people around than whatever they are into? And then which things get most distorted? That's the negative. And if I'm looking at this calculation, I might ask, well, which things are just naturally less distorted by this process? Remember, what are the distortions here? We idealize the sacred, we set it apart, we simplify it, we value it, and math actually isn't that distorted by simplifying it, and it is naturally set apart, but you need to think it, not feel it, so it doesn't fit that much with that part of the sacred, but with a bunch of other parts, it's actually relatively immune to the distortions of the sacred. That's why in that post she's mentioning, I said, look, if you have to have something as sacred, pick something that doesn't get distorted as much by the sacred point of view.
But, I mean, there's kind of a paradox here. Like, if you think, yeah, but it would be, that is, the effect of sacralizing is to distort, in a way you're sort of saying, I'm okay with math being a little bit distorted, but health, no, we need tons and tons of health. Health is super important. It's almost like you're saying health is sacred, and therefore it's like a travesty that we do medicine badly, and we need to make sure, like, we're not doing a terrible job with health. We're just not doing that great. But, like, who says health is even so important, right? But clearly you think it's really important. You want us to do a better job with health. And then you're like, math, we could lose a little bit of accuracy in math, so let's make that sacred instead. So there's almost like, if it isn't sacred, we should think of it that way, and vice versa?
So what happens with love or other things like medicine, what happens as you start to treat it as sacred is you see it from a farther point of view, your mind simplifies it, it drops details, you less attend to the details, you more go with intuition instead of explicit thought, and those can cause you substantial harm in love and medicine. With math, because you just have to reason very explicitly and discreetly, if you start to try to intuit the math, it's just really obvious that you've dropped the math ball. So I just think math is more robust to that because as you start to see it from a distance and intuit the answer, and you write down the answer and it's wrong, then you're quickly slapped and you go back to thinking about math.
I think that
math just doesn't suffer so much.
We're always good at math. So you don't know what it's like for the rest of us where we can very easily just intuit something, be like, that looks good, and move on.
Except you're supposed to check your math, and the
But if it was sacred, some of those requirements would be lifted, right?
Maybe I'm wrong, but that would be another thing you might consider treating as sacred is sky and space. So there's a sense in which sky and space are just more naturally sacred in the sense that they're more naturally abstract. That is, they have fewer details. They vary more, they're more uniform. They're bigger, and I think, in some sense, we have always treated sky and space as a bit sacred, and I don't think we've been terribly distorted because of that. That is, that made us want to fly.
We are far away from it, so treating it as far.
Yes, indeed, right. So it literally is far, and therefore it's less distorted by seeing it as if from afar, because space really is from afar.
So I think somewhere in something you wrote, I think, or maybe somewhere else, I got this idea, this line that makes sense to me, that like the sacred things, all the sacred things tend to merge into one, and that's like maybe part of why we think of God as being like up in the sky. And the idea of God is a kind of, we could think of the idea of God as a kind of way in which all the sacred things could glom together. That's not going to work for every idea of God. Like it doesn't work for Aristotle's God or something who's just very separate from us. But it's going to work for some gods. And so if you think that we're living in a less religious, and we are living in a less religious time, then I guess one effect of that is going to be the fragmentation of the sacred, right? So that there'll be like a lot of separate things that are sacred and they don't all glom together into one big sacred God. What do you think, what are some effects of having the disorganized form of the sacred that we have by contrast with the unified God version?
So, some of the norms of the sacred are that different sacred things don't really conflict with each other, and therefore you can sort of have them all. And there's a norm against sort of trading off the sacred for the profane or even for each other because you're supposed to be able to have them all. Now, with an organized religion, like with God, if God said that one thing ranks higher than another, then, well, that's that. One thing is more sacred than the other, and we'll accept that. Whereas when we're more intuitively thinking of many things as sacred without such a unifying principle, they're just all sacred, and we're not willing to give up any of them, and we're not supposed to have to give up any of them, and so there'll be more of an obstacle in making trade-offs between them. I also just think we've spread our sacred energy out over more areas of life than, say, several centuries ago, Christians would. Christians would focus their sacred energies on God and church, and the things that the church highlighted as especially sacred for the church, say marriage. And then the church basically literally said, this other stuff out there, that's okay. You can compete in business. You can get rich. You can, go kill nature. The church said you just could do all this other stuff, and even if you might have intuitively thought, well, that feels kind of sacred, the church would have said, it's not so sacred, trust us. You can go do all that stuff. And now that the church isn't there to say that stuff's okay, we're not so sure it's okay. We're not so sure that we're okay today with hurting nature, with getting rich, with competing in business, putting somebody out of business by doing a better job than them. We're just spread the sacred energy across more areas of life, and we're just more saying that most of them just have to abide by more sacred rules. And that's an obstacle to innovation because quite often, basically we do make a lot of trade-offs with the sacred, but we won't admit it. And often changes require that you kind of admit that you're making trade-offs, and that's a reason why we are often reluctant to change things once they're seen as very sacred. We just want to keep it alone because that's the way we don't have to admit that we're making trade-offs.
I'm going to ask maybe like 2 more questions because I've indulged myself here. First I actually just want to follow up on this. Your thought about math, making math sacred, was like maybe we can cordon off the sacred into this little area and then not have too much distortion. And then this point about innovation, like you're worried that the sacred is destructive.
Yes.
And I guess it just seems to me like from Durkheim, the thought is that fundamentally overall, the sacred is just vastly more creative than it is destructive. That is, it gives us our motivation. And so shouldn't we worry a lot about shouldn't we worry way more about not having enough sacred than having too much of it?
Well, so I was focused on moving it rather than having less of it.
Well, if you moved it to math.
And the sky, and innovation, and honesty.
But maybe we should just focus on having more of it. Just whatever we've got, let's get more. Don't we just want more motivation, less apathy, less, being focused on the present moment only and narrowly self-interested? And wouldn't the world just be better if there was just a lot more, of what the sacred does for us? Happiness, basically, is what Durkheim says it does for us. Joy.
So let's imagine a monk who sees everything as sacred. Everything around them. All aspects of their lives. Cooking, toilets, everything. All fully sacred. I'm not sure they're actually that much more motivated than the rest of us. I think there's diminishing returns here to thinking of everything as sacred.
Okay, fine.
You actually get more energy that way.
I'm talking about from where we are now, okay, do we want an increase or a decrease in the sacred? And like my instinct, if I just had to pick, someone's like, you are the ruler, Agnes, you're the ruler of the world, and you get to dial this lever, and you can either dial sacred up or down. I think I'd dial it up. Would you dial it down?
I'm less sure about total levels, more sure I want to move it.
Okay, let me ask you a different question. So we've talked about what things you personally see as sacred, and I'm going to list like 3 of them that we've discussed. Music, say certain kinds of music. Church, a little bit, like you grew up religious, and we were once in a church together. We were at a conference in San Antonio, and there was like a church service. And so, like, Robin suggested that we, I'm Jewish, so I, have barely ever been in church services, but, suggested that we come and, watch it, and you can talk about, did you experience the sacredness there? And then the third one is nostalgia. So last night, Robin and I and my family had Giordano's Pizza, because Robin was a student here 40 years ago, and he associated his time here with Giordano's Pizza, and you confessed that you were trying to feel nostalgia because you didn't actually remember what it tasted like, but you're trying to connect to your past self. You're searching for an experience of the sacred. Okay, so these are 3 examples. And so you can both talk about these examples, but then I kind of also want to know, this is my dial example, but a personal version of it. Suppose I had here, I was like, this one over here, Robin, this is the sacred juice, okay? That's why I'm so animated. I've been drinking it. And so you could drink some of this, and then you could have more of this type of thing, like that you have with music or church or Giordano's Pizza, kind of not with the pizza. And would you drink the sacred juice if that's what it did to your life?
So first, it's interesting to postulate the concept of a sacred juice, because I think it would violate the sense of the sacred if it was too easily obtained. If it was unequally obtained, if only the rich could pay for it, then I think we would be offended by that. Or if it wasn't obtained through sort of virtuous, sacred,
in asterisks, there's
sacrifices.
kind of a sacred juice. No one here reads asterisk. Okay. Okay, it'd be 3 people. But
Right.
it's not super easy to obtain. Yeah.
So there's this TV show called The Bear about this restaurant, and it's a good show. And you see these people just get very focused on their restaurant, and they're very motivated in this restaurant. And watching that show, I could see that I could imagine getting into that world. I could be sucked into that world. I could really care about their restaurant. I could really care what's happening there. And then I could also see a part of myself reluctant to let that happen. And in that vision, I can see how we all often know that we could be more motivated. We could actually feel the sacred more, and we choose not to. And I think that's true about love, too. Say, for example, I think we often know that we could be a little more in love, and we are a little more reluctant to do that because we know it's a little dangerous and we can get hurt. And so I think, in fact, when I listen to sacred music that gives me a feeling of sacred, I'm not always so sure I want to do that again soon. I think I see that we portion out the sacred to ourselves, and we don't allow ourselves to feel as much joy or other awesome as we could. I think, it seems remarkable, really, but I think I've seen sometimes what joy feels like, and I can see kind of how you move there and where it goes, and I'm reluctant to do it. I don't want it so easy. I don't want it so cheap. I think I want it rarely in the special occasions that are appropriate for it, and not otherwise.
So one hypothesis about why that might be the case, okay, and this really is going to be my last thing, and then we'll take a break, is so Durkheim notes that there's a kind of asceticism that's connected with religion, right? So religion asks us to deny ourselves. It asks us to not be selfish, to be pro-social, to think of the group, to often to be willing to inflict pain and hunger and death on ourselves. And that Durkheim sees that as that kind of self-abnegation as just almost like the signature of the social, right? It's it's not about you, it's about the group. So you have to squash you to make the group show up. And so do you think maybe part of why we're a bit reluctant about the sacred and about immersing ourselves into it is that we fear we are just going to buy into this culture of asceticism and self-abnegation?
I think it's more that we feel we need to have earned it. But that's the pro-social motivation. We want to have earned it in others' eyes, and so we need to have pleased others enough to have earned it, and then we can enjoy it legitimately.
I just don't understand why there would be a legitimate and an illegitimate enjoyment of the sacred. Is that just part of its being sacred?
So, I mean, there's just ways I can react to this intuitively, and then there's what my theory would say, but...
Tell me what your theory would say.
I don't think my theory has much to say about this.
Okay, then let's go with the other option.
I don't have a different answer than I just gave you.
Okay, okay, that's a good place to pause. We have, I think, out there some cookies and hot chocolate, and so we'll take a break for like 10, 15 minutes, and then you guys can get up and walk around, get some cookies and hot chocolate, and then we will have a Q&A, and in the Q&A, I believe we'll also have T-shirts and tote bags and stuff to give out for people who ask questions. Okay.
Ta-da.
Yeah, so I think this works.
Your mic went on.
Yeah.
Okay, then we can switch back.
Yeah.
Is there a green light now? There it is. Yes, I do. But at least there's some people who will stay.
You can then get a T-shirt or a tote bag over in that corner, and you can do that either at the end when you leave, or you can do it right after you ask your question. You can also leave whenever you feel like it. Okay, we'll be here till about 11:30. Veronica's going to come around, and when you raise your hand, she'll come around and she'll try to, distribute herself among you. So please just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello, Professor Hanson. Thank you. Hello, Professor Hanson. I have noticed a lot of your arguments appear to have a baseline assumption based in Western civilization and the norms of what was historically known as Christendom. For example, you do refer to Emil Durkheim and the argument that the soul is an indivisible piece of, for lack of a better term, energy or material. But I am pretty sure that those who live in civilizations influenced by the Dharmic worldview would argue that the soul may be split or combined, or for example, your soul, Professor, may have been 1% reincarnated by someone else, or 20% reincarnated by someone else here, and that secondarily, there is an argument that, you know what, I'll be honest, I was mainly focused on arguments which would suggest that many of the arguments that you are using may have been unnecessarily influenced by the civilization in which you live in, including how much people how much people explicitly state they are influenced by the culture that they live in. For example, people in China may say they are explicitly influenced by their society. And my main question is, how would you address the argument that your arguments may be influenced by the civilization in which you live in? Professor Hanson.
So I think Agnes is the one who mentioned soul.
True.
I didn't make any claims about souls. And the literature I tried to draw on is as broad as I could find. Durkheim himself, his main data was from Australia and the American Indians. His book is actually not drawn from Western cultures in terms of his analysis.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one criticism Durkheim comes under is that there's just a few Australian tribes that he's drawing on, and that's a kind of a narrow base for a theory of religion. But I guess more generally, we are just all shaped by our culture, and we do just theorize in ways that are reflective of our cultures, and that's an obvious truth when we look at past thinkers. You know, when you read Descartes, when you read Aristotle, you're like, these people are so obviously creatures of their own time and their own culture. They can still be insightful, but I think often the part where we look at ourselves and we're like, I'm a creature of my time and my culture, that's just a lot harder to see than when we look at someone else. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to entertain your theory a little more. So if we are taking the sacred maybe being part of how we, the evolution that our species had, and so we have this tendency biologically maybe towards that. Then I see like a tension with how that was very helpful in the past. Like we had a tribe, and so we all had to band together, and we had an explicit enemy being I don't know, an animal or another tribe. But as we got bigger, then actually that is wrong, because that then makes social cleavages salient, and so you have war and these things that now that we have a bigger world, we don't want. And so there's a tension where you're talking about how maybe the sacred has been displaced and has been broadened, or it's diversified maybe, and you're talking about maybe it's not more or less, but rather you'd like to unite it a little more. But if we do unite it, it seems that the more we unite it, then the more those social cleavages will come out. So you don't want to unite it, but you also don't want it to be diversified, because then we don't have this motivation to move forward as a species. So I see a tension there, and I'd like you to talk maybe a little bit more about that.
So I was trying primarily to give a positive analysis and not make normative conclusions, although Agnes tends to insist on normative conclusions. So my initial presentation was that I started to study this because it was in my way. It just kept getting in my way, and I wanted to figure it out, so maybe I can move it out of my way. So my main motive or thing is, how can I move it somewhere else so it's not in my way? That's consistent with it overall being something we should greatly reduce, or maybe something that we would do better increasing. I don't have a strong basis to take a position there. I don't know. I agree that there's just a lot of ways in which the world has radically changed, and quite plausibly just any ancient system that was designed for a much older era would not be very well tuned for our era. But that's got to be true based pretty much all our social mechanisms. And so you'd like them all to be flexible and changing a bit for the new world, and the sacred looks like something that doesn't want to change that much, which maybe makes you worried about it, making us stuck. So, the first priority here is just what is this thing that's been in my way? And obviously saying that it's been my way is kind of like saying I wish it would get smaller, at least where it's in front of me in my way. But I have to admit, we all actually engage it a lot. It's actually important to all of us. We all treat several things as really sacred. I don't see a way to get rid of that anytime soon, so the best I can think about is how can we move it?
So I think I was the one proposing the advantages of the unified sacred, and I thought Robin made a really interesting point about that, which is that the unified sacred contains in itself a hierarchy, where so that the church can tell you, oh, it's okay to sacrifice love or friendship or health or whatever in the circumstances, and we are living more in a world where we're more at sea about which sacrifices we're supposed to be making, and a lot of times economists want to come along and ask us to do some kind of cost-benefit trade-off thing, and we're like, no, these things are sacred, we can't do that, but we also aren't given the hierarchy by some central authority, right? I guess my hope is that maybe there's some positives to this fragmentation of the sacred, which is, there's a bunch of stuff that we are granted as sacred, but to get it all separated out is to more be in a position to like inquire into those values and ask, what is it that we want about love? You know, what is it that we want in love? By the way, I do think we see sex as somewhat sacred. That's why there's so many taboos around it, and et cetera. So, but like, you know, we had a Night Owls on in this room on sex. These are topics that we can inquire into, I think, more readily because everything has become a bit disjointed. So maybe we can make improvements in how we see things as sacred and what we see as sacred in a world that also has these conflicts. I told them.
Just gonna go. All right. Let's see. Wow. I think maybe a little bit of a continuation, maybe off, you know, what you're saying about you're trying to get something out of your way, right?
Can you guys hear him?
Yeah. Oh. No.
Okay.
Okay. A little bit more. How about this?
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on, right? The green light is on. Okay, yes. Just hold it close. Yeah.
Send it. Okay. Oh, whoa, whoa.
That was-
okay.
that
There we go. Okay. I kind of want to push back though on math, though. I guess maybe a little bit of a loose collection of thoughts, but I think the headline question, summing it all up, is why, if you had to pick one thing, right, to be sacred, why math? Why something so cold? Why something not a little nicer, right? We exist in a time of extreme polarization, of war, of famine and suffering, and COVID still exists until May, right, when the emergency order goes away. So until then, we still have that, right? But and to math, I mean, I understand. I was good at math. All my friends were good at math. That's not a race thing. That's how it was. Anyway, but I spoke intimately with a friend who is right now doing a PhD in math research, right? And it's number theory, right? And I asked him, like, what's the point? And he's like, there is no point. I like math. I sit and I write on paper, and it makes me happy, and I publish this, and it brings me joy, right? And in the hallway, you were talking about how, already we kind of find math a little sacred. Like, probably half of the Americans, that went through the public school system would probably say, like, I never used geometry, algebra ever again in my life after, like, middle school, right? So I just wanted to push back on that and think, why not something like peace, right? Why not something a little bit more abstract, something maybe a little bit more, for lack of a better word, fighting against our base instincts of violence, of, disharmony, of othering people that, we don't agree with, and things like that, right? I think also another thing I wanted to bring up, sorry, again, I did promise you a loose collection of thoughts, but, I think it's, we can argue logistics of the world wars and whatnot, but I think, it's indisputable that, the worst things that mankind has ever produced are the result of stunning math and physics work, right? The dropping of the atomic bombs and, the orders of magnitude more powerful weapons that we have today that we know of and may even not know of, right? The aliens in Area 51, right? But anyway, yeah, so I just wanted to ask what you maybe thought about that, especially, in this kind of a funky time that we live in, and especially when you're thinking about policy and about boots on the ground, right? Telling people what to think and what to get done, what to focus on, what to center their life around, right? What to find sacred, yeah.
I do not claim that only math should be sacred. Just make that very clear. That's not the proposal. I was just looking for things where if you moved sacred energy toward there, it would distort less. And I'm looking for things, and I thought the math looks like a relatively safe place to move sacred energy. I mean, it sounds like you want sacred energy moved wider to other big things you care about that you now see as sacred. And that's the world we live in, that people have spread their sacred attention across large areas of life, you know. And that's where we are. Think of, you guys all saw the Avatar movie, right?
The new one or the old
The first one,
First
right?
one, yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, basically, there's on another planet, but there's this, you know, indigenous tribe, and they've got their grounds they live in, and some outside force wants to come in and dig up their tree because there's valuable minerals under it. And, you know, basically, it's sacred to them, and they don't want that, right? And if you think about like a group like that and just, not just the one tree, but the tree over there and that tree and this creek and that hill, like once everything in the area is sacred, then you really can't change much. That's the thing I'm worried about, is that as we spread our sacred sense across everything, nothing will be allowed to change because it's all sacred. And then growth will stop.
Hello, I'm over here. A couple questions. So one is, and they're semi-related, but I'm not sure how related. Are all potential objects that, you know, things we could move towards as being more sacred? It seems to me like they're not all equal in potential in terms of becoming new sacred objects. If I told everyone to become, you know, fans of the earthworm, I might get a few followers, but not all. And I guess a related question is like, how much I'm curious about like decoupling, I guess like what you get from the sacred, sort of sacred psychological effects from, I guess being immersed in the sacred, to make that a little bit more concrete. Recently, I had an interesting sort of like religious ecstatic experience where I was in Jerusalem at the Western Wall, and I went into like, there's this little section where a bunch of people pray. A bunch of rabbinical figures and Jewish Orthodox are praying. And I sort of went through a religious ecstatic experience, even though I'm not like a believer in Abrahamic religion or God, and I think it was like largely can be attributed to all of the energy, the sacred energy that was going around in that little chasm. And so I was sort of like in a way piggybacking off of all of their like having a sacred object in the Western Wall, but I was still able to like get the positive effects. So I guess like that would be an instance of like decoupling there, where I'm not like believing in the sacred thing, but I'm still like receiving positive effects from it. Do you think we could like get those sorts of effects without like becoming immersed in like sacralizing belief in other sort of instances? The questions are kind of related, but not so much.
Before Robin answers, I just have to say that like a month ago or so, I was in Jerusalem for the first time, and I went to the same place, to the women's side.
Yeah,
And
no.
I walked up to the wall, and then I waited until there was a gap, because to get up to it, you know, there's like kind of a crowd. And the second I like got up to it and I leaned my head against it, the second my head touched it, just tears started streaming down my face, like out of nowhere. It was incredible. Like I was like, where's this coming from? So anyway, I had a similar experience. Okay, you can answer now.
I'm happy to hear more from you, though. But basically, you know, our recent Western religions heavily emphasize belief, and most religions in history didn't emphasize it as much. Not that all religions didn't have some associated beliefs, but it just wasn't as important. And, you know, the fact that you have reactions to things that aren't mediated by your beliefs just is a big clue there's other stuff going on inside you than your beliefs. It's not that first you believe something and then you do something or feel something. There's just all this other stuff going on. But, I mean, Durkheim or other sociologists would say your subconscious is doing a lot of clue reading, and it's noticing that other people treat this as very sacred, and that matters to you and your subconscious. You want to be with other people. You want to value something other people value. And to join with them and not be lonely, you need to find a way to see what they value as valuable too. And your subconscious found a way to join with them. And And in some sense, that's how most people grow up in a culture and assimilate the cultures, religion, etc., is by that sort of social energy, by children initially wanting to be accepted and wanting to feel what other people feel and to do what other people do and to be part of the culture. To be a man, to be a woman in their culture is to see things how other people see them.
I want to add one thing, which is like there's actually just one sentence of your essay that was my favorite sentence of it. I thought it was really insightful and it went by really fast. If you ever read stuff that Robin writes, often it's extremely compressed and you have to like sit there and kind of, he tries to say like stuff in very, very few words. So anyway, you observe that, when it comes to sacred things, because we're seeing them from afar, we actually feel a deficit of near contact with the thing, right? So it's like with love or God or whatever, we actually can feel like, well, the thing is really far away, right? It always feels really far away because we're representing it as far. And then we can fill that deficit by giving extra significance, I hear I'm quoting you, to concrete objects associated with sacred topics. So I thought that was a great explanation of why like symbols have such a big place in the sacred, is that we need to make up the difference between how far the thing feels and how close we want it to be, but we can't make it up by seeing it up close. And so we have these things that stand in for it, like maybe a wall, right? These objects that stand in for the sacred, but it doesn't look like we can obviously manipulate those so easily. Like, so if I was like, well, the way you see the Western Wall, see earthworms that way or something, it doesn't work, right? So it's because we really do somehow see those objects as really actually imbued with the force of the faraway thing.
Imagine that your spouse had died a year ago, and you go through some old things and you find a love letter and you're holding it in your hand. You might tear up in a way that you wouldn't had you thought about the possibility of holding the love letter. Or you're a soldier, and your buddies died in the battle, and now you're holding the flag that was at the funeral of your buddy in your hand, and you're touching the cloth. It feels different. That is, you have this abstract thing that you want to connect to, and it's far away, and now you've got a concrete thing that connects you to it, and that's precious.
Yeah, this is actually somewhat relevant to Agnes's remark that sex is almost sacred because it's taboo, or vice versa. Is there a phenomenon that sometimes happens where we decry something as unsacred because we sense that it has too much sacred power? I'm kind of thinking specifically of like the satanic panic of the 70s and 80s, and these phenomena where like really conservative religious people are like, don't listen to that music, or like don't wear that clothing, or don't read that book, because they understand implicitly the power of those things, and they're worried that it will kind of carry you away. I guess, like, in short, does our trying to ban something moving mean that it actually is sacred, even if we say that it's, like, illicit?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because something we didn't get to that was on my list of questions is the evil sacred. Because, like, we've just been talking about the good side of the sacred, right? But there's the evil sacred. So, yeah, I want to hear more about that.
The idea is that we join together by seeing things the same, and the things we're seeing are sacred things, but we can often see them in a very negative light instead of a positive light, but we can still join together by seeing them as negative. And yes, presumably, one of the ways that we can value one thing more is if there's a thing that competes with it, we make that negative. And so there are some things that some cultures could see as positive and others see as negative, and that's probably because they're competing with the other thing, right? And so certainly in Christianity, sex, you'd say if they're trying to promote traditional marriage norms, then they're trying to suppress young lust, which to a young person can feel quite sacred, but they're trying to tell you that's in conflict. That is, this world of people around you, if you want to be with them and see things their way, this is not, you're seeing them the opposite of this way, and you will be a pariah. You will be rejected by this community if you see that as sacred.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the things that are evil are often things where there's a question of being seduced by it, right? Like, I remember this was one of my most, actually, somehow this memory I have it because it's associated with extreme embarrassment, but when I was in junior high school, I was in a class called General Music, which is where they put people who didn't have enough talent to be in band, orchestra, or chorus. So people who could even sing a little bit were in chorus, and then if you could play an instrument, you were in band or orchestra. If you couldn't do anything, you were in general music. And I don't think we learned anything. But there was one time where they were gonna play, he was like playing some music, he was going to play Metallica. And I had this idea that like it was satanic or evil or something. It was a vague thought, but I was just like trying to cover my ears so that I wouldn't listen to it. And like I genuinely was just afraid of this music, but I also was like, knew I would look like an idiot if the people in the class thought I was like afraid of music. That was like that thought of like, this is the satanic or this is the, the evil, but it can seduce me. It can seduce me into seeing it as good. And that supports the thought that a lot of the stuff that's evil is stuff that we see as good, but then we have some like reason for reversing it. The evil is tempting.
Hi, yeah, this is mainly directed at Robin. I'm wondering how much this theory of the sacred owes to the notion of a scapegoat mechanism, the sort of Girardian idea, if that was at all something that entered your thinking. Because in some ways it seems like that same assignation of value to something that is far away from the group to build group cohesion, that sounds a lot like the way that the scapegoat functions in that line of thinking. And just as an aside, it seems like the judgment as to what this actually means for the reality of the sacred is something, beyond our understanding of reality is not necessarily dictated by that. Girard was a Catholic, so that's my question.
So I tried to read a number of things that covered the sacred. Girard was one of them, and tried to collect what I saw as sort of common elements from many different sources about the sacred. Certainly sacrifice is a very common element of the sacred. That is, people not only do sacrifice, they just want to. They want to sacrifice, and sacrifice a lot so that they can show their devotion to the sacred. And so people go out of their way to do extra, what we might think of as unnecessarily harmful sacrifice. But I honestly didn't see anybody else but Girard talking about scapegoats. So I didn't include that in my correlates because it seemed like it was just one guy with his one thing. I'm trying to make a judgment here, not including everything anybody says, but like have multiple sources for each thing.
So my thought about like Girard versus Durkheim is that if you think about what like the basic social problem is, for Durkheim, there's just this primitive thing of like people coming together and then getting a kind of energy by being together, by being one in some way, this like collective effervescence. For Girard, there's another problem that has to get solved, which is reciprocal violence. For Girard, that's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is if people are together, at some point, someone is gonna trip someone is gonna end up with killing someone from anger or not from anger or from accident or something. And then if I kill you, then all your friends are gonna come and kill me, and then my friends are gonna come and kill that guy, and our society is gonna implode. And Girard see that as like the fundamental problem of having a society is reciprocal violence. And the reason why that problem shows up is that Girard is presupposing, in a way that Durkheim I think isn't, that there's some kind of that violence is so significant and meaningful to people that the only way to recognize that meaningfulness of like my murder of you would be that I would have to get murdered too, right? So it's like there's like a kind of sanctity of human life that's coming in at the ground level of the theory. And so then the whole rest of Girard's theory comes off of that, where it's like, okay, there's this fact of violence and we don't know how to handle it, so we're gonna have to displace it onto some it can be the scapegoat, it could be the king, it can come out the top or the bottom, Girard says, right? And I think that is a very distinctive framing. That's a very Girardian framing of the social problem, I guess. And I think that just Durkheim doesn't see, there's no accident that his book is called Violence and the Sacred, right, Girard's book. You end up with that position of the scapegoat as being so significant if you think what you're basically doing is solving the problem of violence.
I mean, there's no doubt that violence is sacred. Happy to grant that. I just think, there may be some other unusual things with violence that are true that aren't true for other sacred things. So I was trying to look at just things that are generally true about the sacred, and that seems more specific to violence.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here and hosting this. I was wondering how cults are associated with the idea of the sacred, and associated with that, how vulnerability or a general lack of direction in life influences how someone perceives the sacred.
So
You can
asked,
speak from firsthand experience, right? Because you joined a cult.
did you say occult or cults?
Cults.
Cults. So I was, in fact, a member of a cult as a tween. So my parents were very religious. My dad was a pastor. My parents were missionaries together. And then as a 12-year-old or so, I took the initiative to participate in a Pentecostal church. My parents weren't Pentecostals, and then got more involved in that. And then eventually my parents sort of forbade me to do it anymore because they didn't like that very emotional, involved sort of religion. In any case, the standard story is that, cult is another name for a religion that didn't get very far because otherwise it would be called a religion. It's just, a name for putting down a smaller thing that doesn't grow very far. Obviously, initially, small things that grow at all have to have an unusual degree of passion and energy and devotion. So there's in the literature on religion, there's just a standard distinction between religions on how much they ask of you. So say the Unitarians hardly ask anything, and then Orthodox Jewish say ask a lot, and then there's a bunch of correlates of religions that ask a lot. Also, they bond together much more strongly. They can trust each other more, they rely on each other more, they get more out of it as well. So cults are religions that ask a lot. So we might distinguish, groups bonded by sacred things. How bonded are they? Just how strongly bonded are they by the things they share? And part of that's going to be how much do they sacrifice for it. That's one of the key ways they're going to see how bonded they are. And a cult is one of those stronger bonded groups.
Yeah, I mean, Durkheim, when he's distinguishing between magic and religion, he would call cults religion, right? But he just distinguishes between magic and religion. And he says religion, magic is going to already involve, a set of beliefs and practices in relation to sacred things. But it's when you get united into a single moral community, that's when you have a religion. And so a cult would just be a smaller moral community, I guess.
Hi, thank you. Professor Hanson, I know you said that, is this working? You think that things that are held sacred are less likely to change, and that's one reason why you might be afraid of a lot more things becoming sacred. And I think that to me, that doesn't seem quite true. I mean, something that I think of as being held sacred is love. We were talking a lot about, and I think love is something.
Sorry, Theo,
yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit slower?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. I think of love as being something that is fairly susceptible to change. We see a lot of media about love, like the New York Times modern love stories and show, and plenty of romantic comedies like When Harry Met Sally and Bridget Jones' Diary are about how love can change to accommodate different social situations and different people, and how love evolves. And it seems like people think about this a great deal, whereas things that I think that you both would agree aren't held sacred, like I was thinking of parapsychology, like the fringe branch of psychology that accommodates for the idea that some people might be experiencing supernatural, that might be experiencing supernatural powers in their minds. It seems to me that we don't hold that sacred. We often think of it as silly, and I don't think that discipline has changed very much. Or radishes, we don't hold radishes very sacred, and I don't think they've changed a great deal. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. I just didn't agree with that point.
So I-
Sorry, before you answer, I keep forgetting to say, there's more cookies. So as you leave, if you want to go grab some cookies, or if you want to just go grab some cookies and come back, feel free. Okay.
So I wasn't hearing that well. So you're an example that love is a kind of sacred thing that's allowing changes, you said, and then you were giving contrasting other things like superstition as a thing that was sacred that was changing or not.
That was not sacred, but stable, I take it, right?
Sorry, yeah, as parapsychology, for instance, or plenty of things that aren't sacred, I think there are a lot of examples of things that aren't sacred that hold pretty stable. The other example, like, you know, radishes or like a certain rock that we don't hold sacred, I don't think they change very much.
So let's start with love. So love is one of the big movers in the last century in terms of changing its degree of sacredness up. So for example, once upon a time, marriage was very sacred, and then love was tied and related to marriage, but marriage was more sacred than love. And then people made the argument, I guess persuasively, that there are often actually conflicts between love and marriage. And in the past, such conflicts were supposed to be resolved in favor of marriage, and people convinced people that no, they should be resolved in favor of love, and therefore marriage was demoted, in essence, compared to love. And then a lot of the energy of sexual preferences and things like that in the last few decades is based on the sacredness of love. Basically, people say, look, people love people on the basis of these criteria, and that should trump everything else. And so that's been a driving force between a lot of new kinds of love that are accepted because we've come to accept those as sacred and those loves as sacred. But the kinds of love we think are not sacred, we still don't allow, and they are especially taboo. And so we aren't universal about all pairs of people who love each other are accepted. We still have many such pairs, I don't have to say them, you can figure them out, where those pairs aren't, love claimed between those pairs not accepted. And that's a way in which our sense of love is going to restrict those behaviors. That is, once we agree on a certain set of who's allowed to love who, then the things that violate that are just not allowed. And that's a way in which change isn't allowed, right? I mean, so if we change what we see as sacred, then we'll allow that change, but that's different than sort of just allowing a lot of variety of behavior.
So, I mean, I think Theo was pointing to the thought that there's a kind of evolution of the sacred, so that love does change. Like, it was, homosexual love was prohibited, absolutely prohibited in some of the ways that, incest continues to be prohibited. And now that's not the case anymore, so that's like a change. And so maybe when you say that it doesn't change, what you mean is that there are certain synchronic prohibitions at a given moment, but not that it couldn't change over time.
Right, so take the example of the village with all the sacred places near it, like the sacred hill and the sacred river and the sacred tree and the sacred other things. I mean, basically, until you convince people that the tree is no longer sacred, you can't cut down the tree. And that means the more things that are sacred, just the more things that you can't change until you get people to change their mind about what's sacred. Whereas in a non-sacred space, you're just allowing a lot more changes. If a whole area of trees and rivers and something isn't sacred, then somebody can just go and change those without getting permission from everybody else and making them all change their mind about what's sacred.
Of course, it may be that in that world, nobody is motivated to change anything because everyone is so dispirited and listless because they find nothing to be sacred.
Right, but we didn't postulate a world with nothing sacred. We just said
The magical sacred things that don't get in the way of anything you might want to do. Okay, questions?
I would like to push back a little bit against the idea that the sacred is set apart. So most of the correlates in section D, that there are some things that are sacred and other things that are not sacred, and those things are totally separate. I think I'd like to echo the point that seems to come from like a very Western and specifically Christian framework. And specifically, I'm thinking about Shinto and like Japanese religion, wherein, like for example, money is often exchanged at temples, like sacred things are purchased, bought and sold. And also that objects like cell phones and wallets and all sorts of like mundane things are imbued with kami or spirits that have like a sacredness to them. So the way I see sacredness is more a question of distribution or degree, rather than some things are sacred and some things are not sacred. And I also think it's difficult to disambiguate the materiality of something from the sacredness of it. So for example, if a tree is sacred, is it just sacred because there's some kind of force behind it, or is the tree itself in its materiality also sacred? I would lean towards the latter. So I just wonder if you're open to sacredness as a question of things being a different amount of sacred and it being evenly distributed across the world instead of some things are sacred and some things are not.
I tried to draw on many sources here, and not only Durkheim, but pretty much all the sources I said emphasize the set-apartness as one of the main distinguishing features of the sacred. In fact, I would say it's the most common thing I saw mentioned as sacred is set apart. So let's take a Japanese temple as an example. I've been in them. Imagine allowing skateboard park going through the temple. Imagine allowing selling drinks in the temple. I mean, you can start to see various ways you can mix the temple with other activities, and people would say, no, you're not allowed to do that, right? Maybe you're allowed to go buy the incense you go put in the temple or something, but temples are set-apart spaces with set-apart activities in a very distinct way.
Like, I wonder whether this event would be allowed to happen in a Japanese temple. It's actually very striking that we are allowed to hold this event, which is not exactly a religious event, and then we have one of these on sex, right? In this space, right? So we're kind of promiscuous, I guess, with our sacred spaces. This would be an example of such a mixture. People are eating, people are doing all sorts of things. But maybe your thought would be then it's a little bit less sacred?
I think so, yes.
Can I just read a quote from Durkheim on this? Because I think Robin's really right that for Durkheim, this is like the number one thing. He says, all known religious beliefs, okay, all, that's broad, but all right, present one common characteristic. They presuppose a classification of all the things, real and ideal, of which men think, into two classes or opposed groups, generally designated by two distinct terms that are translated well enough with the words profane and sacred. So, like, I just want to piggyback on this question, because I had a question about this, which is like, one worry you might have is like, well, can't they be mixed or whatever? Another question is just like, why are there only two? Why aren't there ever just maybe three or something? Maybe there's a third thing besides sacred and profane, degrees of sacredness. Like, why, why couldn't there be different kinds of sacred, and then in some kinds of sacred, there would be like a 3-part or a 4-part distinction, and then some other kinds, there would just be 2-part. Why is it? What explains this rigidity, or is this Durkheim's rigidity?
Good. So what I often see with people studying the sacred is they notice these correlates and they nod and they say, that makes intuitive sense, and they don't actually ask, yeah, but what theory implies this? That's the sort of thing I'm bringing to this, is to be more anal about that and say, yeah, it makes intuitive sense, but why? Why would that happen? And that's one of the correlates I was trying to explain here. So yes, why is it set apart? It doesn't have to be set apart in order to bind us together or to value it, and we need an additional explanation. And that's what I was these other 4 correlates, I would say, are not very well explained just by the fact they're binding groups together, and that's what I was trying to explain with this idea that sacred things we see from afar to see them the same. And that's different from non-sacred things, which we see according to their actual distance. And that's a binary switch. That is, either you see something by its distance, or you see it always afar, regardless of its distance, and there's not much middle ground there. And that's the story. Our brains develop this capacity to flip a switch and see it from afar, even when it's close, and that gives us the sense of something sacred and transcendent and otherworldly. But there's a switch. And that would be one way to explain why there's that set apart distinction. You have to flip a switch somewhere, and that makes a sharp distinction.
So I was curious, since you're a professor of economics, and you've kind of been talking about the economic logic behind the sacred. For example, you were talking about how it's kind of deeply resistant to that sort of logic and where it's something that's hard to quantify or measure up. But at the same time, you've also explained how valuable sacrifices are to the sacred. And it seems like there's some economic logic there, also regarding like group buy-in and the trade-offs to group buy-in. So I'm just wondering, how do you see like these economic theories fitting with the sacred?
So first of all, economists do understand sacrifice. So it's called signaling. And my second book, The Elephant in the Brain, is a lot about signaling and understanding about how signaling pervades a lot of areas of life. So showing that you are willing to pay a cost is signaling, called costly signaling. So economists get that. But honestly, I'm not an economist in a certain sense. I mean, I was, but I've just become the person who just goes wherever I think the interesting questions are and uses whatever tools I can find and reads whatever previous work is relevant. And in this case, that was a lot of sociology. And in other cases, it's other things. So I'm not here with my economist hat on. I'm here with my scholar intellectual hat on, saying this is an interesting question, and I've learned some skills by this point in my life, and I'm just going to do whatever it takes to figure this out.
But when you say that, like, the sacred has stood in your way your whole life,
Yes.
that was in some sense, as an economist, that it stood in your way, right?
Well, it was in the sense that, like an economist, I often think of ways to use money and incentives and numbers to make important things happen, and then the rules of the sacred often say that's a no-no. And so I was finally frustrated to say, why are all these rules saying that these apparently reasonable things we economists want to do are no-nos? And that's the point at which I then go read the literature and collect the correlates and try to explain them. And now I'm not sure if I can get them out of my way or not. That is, it looks pretty hard to get this out of my way, unfortunately.
Hi, so I had a question about something on the handout, number 23, which reads that experts of the sacred are prestigious and trusted and are often allowed to break sacred rules. And I was wondering if you could talk about what the sacred rules are and why, if you're allowed to break them for other sacred purposes, why they would be sacred in the first place?
So it is puzzling that the experts of the sacred are often allowed to break sacred rules, but Durkheim mentions that several times, for example, and I've seen that elsewhere. So in my conclusion of the essay, I note that there's this puzzle, which is if we try to see the sacred from afar to see it together, if we have experts on the sacred, they're going to have to be looking at a lot of near stuff, right? So you and I, dealing with medicine, can just say, I'm just going to trust the doctors. I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to have faith in the system, and that's how I'll deal with my stress about medicine. I see medicine as if from afar. But the doctor has to look at more details than that, right? And so the question is, how do the priests of the sacred maintain a distance if they're really paying attention to more details? And that's a question. There's only a limited number of ways they could do it. Like, one is they could just fail, right, and not feel the sacred with respect to it, and the rest of us just look the other way and pretend that's not happening, and we just give the priests the benefit of not seeing it as sacred. Or somehow they can separate themselves and look at the details in a practical, profane way, and then suddenly switch when high-level issues show up. So like the mathematicians can see math as sacred in general, and then do the math in a near mode, and switch back and forth in some way. I don't know, but that's a basic question about the sacred, but it seems related to why we would let them break rules.
So I have a question about that, which is like, it seems, my mom's a doctor, and so I grew up with we were socializing our doctors, lots of doctors everywhere, and let me tell you, they see medicine as sacred. That is, they're not less seeing it as sacred than the average person. They are more seeing it as sacred. And you might have predicted, given that they are forced to see it up close all the time, that they would more struggle to see it as sacred. But these people, I mean, unless I had a non-representative sample or true believers, to the degree that many of us would not be. So what explains how the people who are forced to and must see the thing as sacred, and I suspect the same thing will be true of people involved in religious professions,
Right.
how they actually manage to maintain it in the face of the close-up. That suggests we could all be seeing it from close-up and still succeed.
So one way to think about it might be, Lord, of dimensions of the discussion or analysis that we see aligned with the key sacred dimension, and then other dimensions that we see as orthogonal enough that we can switch modes to seeing the details. So, for example, your doctor relatives may, when faced with the question, should medicine be applied here, or should we do more, just always say yes. But then, which medicine, how, might be seen as not threatening that, and therefore allowed to think in details. Or the priest, say, of a church like this might always say, is more religion good? Yes. But then, should the service be at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., that may seem to be orthogonal to the large things that they are focused on. And then they can be more practical about, well, who will show up at 10 and who will show up at 11. And so we may just draw these lines, the set-apart lines, between the part of the process that's sacred that we have to just follow the party line, and the other parts that are independent enough that we can switch into seeing the details, thinking about them, and not threatening our stance on the sacred part.
And yet the fact that breaking the rules is permitted, right, suggests that that doesn't work completely. That is, that there isn't this separation. And
Yes.
yet, it still seems the case that these people are, let's say, more inclined to see this thing as sacred than the average person, not less so, I think much more so, even though they're breaking the rules, so even though these things come into conflict. That just seems like a remaining puzzle.
So based on other things we've talked about, I have recently come to respect the human capacity for incoherence and inconsistency. I think we just are incoherent and inconsistent to much larger degrees than we let on, and this is showing an example of that.
That's a dangerous thing to be able to invoke when you want to, though.
Yes?
Okay, I think we can take a few more questions. Maybe we have maybe 20 more minutes left.
Oh, thank you for hosting this event. And okay, my question is like, well, let me first do a quick argument reconstruction of what you just said before. That so you were saying like we have this feeling of secretness, and in order to experience it fully and completely, we should restrict its use, right? We should save it for some special occasions and circumstances. So in those times, we can actually immerse in those times and have a better experience. If we use it too much, it just becomes bad. And okay, so my question is like, why should we save our feelings of secretness for special occasions? So a response would be like, just for better religious or religious aesthetics experience, right? We have better experience. But why not just let this kind of feeling of secretness just slide away? I mean, just as the Professor Kalaja said, might there not be something positive to this fragmentation of secretness? I mean, if we have this secretness fragmented in different things, sports, music, art, why is it bad? So if we are trying to conserve our feeling of secretness, we're conserving it for what purpose? Are we saving it for some bigger event, bigger occasions? Why? Thank you.
You've heard the phrase, every day is Children's Day?
I
It's what happens when children ask, why is there a Father's Day and a Mother's Day, but no Children's Day? Right? So I guess there's this common wisdom that feels like it makes sense, although I don't know necessarily how to predict it from theory, that like things set apart are special when they're rare. That if every day is a holiday, it's not really very special. You need to set apart special days to be special, to be different from the other days, and that seems closely related to the set apart, profane, sacred distinction. That is, if everything is sacred, then nothing's profane and there isn't the distinction. So, I mean, with Durkheim and others, the idea is like you have your usual life, and you know it's hard and it's tough and even boring, and then we have some special thing that happens once in a while where you get to switch modes, and in these special times and places, you get to feel a lot more and do a lot more and remember it later, but it's special because it's rare. Question is how far that goes. I mean, obviously, say you have a weekend and you work the rest of the week. Well, you might like just retire and have the weekend all week, and that's not terrible for people who are retired. So I don't think it's obvious theoretically. But it does seem like people who try to make everything sacred all the time, there's just not many people who've succeeded very much at that, right? I don't know of any social groups that really make that work. So it seems like, at least for the sacred, it has to be somewhat rare.
Yeah, as I was asking that earlier, I was like, as I was saying it, almost like the words were starting to collapse coming out of my mouth, because like when Robin was saying, well, you have to sort of deserve it, I feel like it's almost like he was saying, well, it has to be a sacrifice, which is like saying it has to be sacred, right? That there's a way in which if the sacred just comes too easy, then you haven't performed the relevant sacrifice that would actually allow the thing to be sacred. So the concept of rarity and indeed of sacrifice is like built in. That like in some sense, like part of the suffering that the sacred entails is that you can't like allow it to yourself all the time.
Thank you.
Hello. I would also like to push back on math, not because I find it cold. I think it can actually be very warm and fuzzy, but because I think it might be an exceptionally bad thing to make sacred, like worse than healthcare or love or even democracy, because even the smallest amount of distortion could do a lot of damage. Like, you know how, like, sacred religions can often have groups that get very attached to a particular version or interpretation of the sacred text or corpus of beliefs, and they don't want that to change no matter what. Like, you could end up with something, I think, analogous to like a Newtonian gravity cult setting the course for a generation ship heading to Proxima Centauri, and then, that's not optimal. And then also, since it's math, it's the sort of thing where you can build a vast edifice and you put one stone out of place, maybe because your view of it is distorted a little because it's sacred, and the whole edifice collapses. Whereas if in something like healthcare, I think is much less susceptible to that, although not like entirely unsusceptible to that. So do you think that math might be a bad idea for those reasons?
So in school, we use math a lot to evaluate students and to inspire students because it seems to be especially robust to manipulation and distortion by interested parties. That's why, in some sense, we often rely so much on math to sort of evaluate people who come from different areas and different backgrounds, and that we trust if they've learned math, they've actually learned something, because there's just all these different ways we can check on math. So central to math is not just the fact that it's built on assumptions, but that there's just usually lots of different paths to check any given result, which makes it pretty robust to attempts to distort it. That's one of the major attractions to math, is that it's so resistant to distortion. That is, You can try to make woke math if you wanted. I'll laugh at that because we just see it's not going to work. You can't make woke math. Math doesn't do that. And that's a remarkable, cool thing about math, which is one of the reasons why if you make it sacred, it won't be distorted in the ways you fear, because math is just really solid against that sort of stuff. That's one of the reasons I would say, yeah, throw your energy at that, because you're not going to knock that down.
But like, isn't that just an argument to the effect that we can't make math sacred?
No, because you can elevate it, you can respect it, you can see it as separate, as ethereal, as eternal, as unblemished, as unpolluted, as near the core of the essence of things. A lot of these correlates actually apply to math naturally without distortion.
But the key one, on your view, namely our ability to apply FAR mode, does not apply.
It can apply to the overall value of math, just not to the calculation of each particular theorem, right? So we do in fact treat math as relatively sacred in school, in our world. In fact, we highly value math more than its actual practical value. And that is the current status in universities and other schools today.
I think I'm just less confident than you are that zealous mathists wouldn't find a way to distort it, but I will give this to the next questioner.
So, first of all, thank you for the talk. Second, I buy your argument pretty strongly that math is an appropriate thing to make sacred. And full disclosure, I'm a math student at my core. Well, math and econ, so I'm fully on board with that. But what is your prediction of the meaningful transformation that we would see in society making math sacred? Are we going to start having math churches? I wish we would. Are we going to start to see math as like an object that like the Pythagorean cult, or is it more a transformation in the way we evaluate things, in the sense that like we have slogans about love, we don't really have a church of love outside of some place in California, so on and so forth?
I'm not sure I heard that very well.
I'll paraphrase it. What kinds of predictions do you have about the ways in which the world would be transformed if we did see math as sacred? Like, would we have math churches and things like that?
I haven't thought it through very much, but I mean, as Agnes knows better than I, math was relatively sacred in the ancient world. That is, the Pythagoreans, I believe, had an integrated religious math kind of world. I don't know much about it, but they did go farther than we do in terms of the other. And part of it was like math secrets, right?
The incommensurability of the diagonal, that was a big deal. Like, when human beings like first figured that out, that just kind of, it should blow your mind, right? That there's no unit that can measure the side of the diagonal. Like, how can that possibly be? So you gotta keep that under wraps.
I mean, as a physicist, basically, once we know that quantum mechanics is the correct physical theory and that it's a weird kind of math compared to what we're using, it's kind of a mystical experience. You go, look at this weird math, that's reality, and you're kind of an out-of-body, out-of-world, transcendent experience, because the actual physical world is transcendently weird compared to what you thought it was, and math is what expresses that.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what would it look like if we made philosophy sacred?
I think philosophy is kind of sacred.
Yet you look at detailed calculations and arguments.
Well, this is why I was, pushing you on that a little bit at the beginning, because it's actually not totally clear to me that those things are not combinable. And like, in fact, your very idea of we can have sacred math, it seems to me it actually is possible to see something as sacred, but also to do a certain kind of argumentation. And I think that one thing that you will see that is the mark of the sacred in philosophy is often there'll be certain, a philosopher giving a talk today will often say, this happened at a talk I went to, like, the kind of view I'm attracted to is, or something, where it's like, and you might ask, why not you just be attracted to the truth? Like, why don't you just go with whatever view is true, right? But they have an inner, like almost like an inner compass that is gravitating somewhere to the way that they want the world to be, the structure that they want to see. And often for philosophers, it's going to be anti-reductive, right? Anti what they would call scientistic. Not all, but many, you know, not even most, but like there will be philosophers like this. And so there is going to be, I see that as an element of the sacred, and it is an element also of irrationality that is introduced into philosophy. Not necessarily overall a bad thing. Often people who are willing to be a bit irrational in those ways just produce more interesting ideas. But then you still do have to evaluate them fully as like, are they true? So I think it is a bit sacred, and I think another indication of the philosophy as being a bit sacred is there's like a little bit of a problem with calling yourself a philosopher. I remember when I was an undergrad here, and I was getting advice on like where I go to grad school. I was thinking about classics, I was thinking about philosophy. I ended up going to classics. And I remember the person that I was getting advice from, a professor here, was like, he's like, look, whatever you do, don't ever like call yourself a philosopher. That's just not like, you can say you study philosophy, you can say you read about philosophy, you can say you make philosophical arguments, but don't say you're a philosopher. And it was almost like he was saying, that's like saying you're God. It's not acceptable, right? You know, people called Aristotle for a while the philosopher, right? Like, there's only one. So that's sort of like saying God. So I do think there is this sense of it's a very elevated category, and it's not clear who deserves to call themselves it. And it's like, just because you got a PhD, now you get to call yourself a philosopher. That, you know, that doesn't seem like you've applied enough, strict enough criteria. So I think those are some ways in which philosophy already is sacred. If it became more sacred, would I want it to become more sacred? That's hard, I guess. I guess I can think of a couple of different ways of it becoming more sacred, and some of them will be bad and some of them would be good.
So there's philosophy as seen by academic philosophers, and there's philosophy as seen by the larger public. And I think the concept that the larger public has in mind when they hear the word philosophy is in fact a pretty sacred concept. And then academic philosophers has this struggle how much they want to embrace that description or label, but they have available to them a pretty sacred concept that's already out there in the public as what the public sees as sacred philosophy.
Hey, so my question is, how does something become sacred, or how do you make something sacred? Because I can see, I mean, earlier Agnes was talking about like personal ecstatic experiences, so I can see how love can become sacred, like if you have that ecstatic experience of it, or, you know, a religious experience like touching the West Wall in Jerusalem. But for other things like sports talk or medicine, how does one come to see those things as sacred? I mean, like, we view medicine as sacred now, but when did that happen, and how?
That's definitely one of the parts that I didn't try to figure out in my theory analysis. Yes, there's all these things that are sacred and they change over time. I can at least see some of the process, but that's not all of the process. One of the things I can see is things have changed when conflicts were made salient. Like I talked about the conflict between love and marriage, or even between sex and love. I mean, when we come to accept that these conflicts are real, then we have to reorder what we see as sacred in order to accommodate these conflicts, which is often why we want to deny the conflicts.
So I had two thoughts here. One of them is just about a way in which it's difficult to make stuff sacred, which is that, like, I don't know, if you've ever like been in a romantic relationship where you've like, I want there to be like our song, you know, what's gonna be our song? And then it's kind of hard, it can be kind of hard and awkward and artificial to be like, okay, this is gonna be our song. And that's like a little bit like the attempt to create the sacred. But at the other polar extreme, I think one answer is just time. Like a lot of these buildings, like a campus building, UChicago buildings, to me have this air of the sacred, or rather they did, until I went to Oxford, like 5 or 6 years ago, and it was like, oh, this is like the real version that my school is like the imitation of. And now all of a sudden my school looks kind of like cheesy and Disney-esque compared to Oxford. Why? It's just older, right? And so there's just some weird way in which something's being around for a very long time. Sometimes you go somewhere and, I mean, I was traveling all over Israel, and sometimes there would just be some like rocks, and they're like, maybe Jesus was near these rocks. Okay, these are like holy rocks. And so just stuff being really old often makes it sacred, and that's interesting. I guess it's similar to the nostalgia point about Robin connecting to his past self with the Giordano's pizza, is like we want to connect to our human past selves from a long time in the past.
So that's the last section of correlates on the list, was about how concrete things become sacred by association with abstract things and just the raw experience. I'm now an older person. I'm 63 years old, and I can see that just the longer I have some contact with things in my life, the more sacred it becomes to me. I mean, nostalgia is a sense in which you just have personal sacred things because of your long association with them. Not everything you have a long association with is sacred, but there's just a natural process by which continuing to have a non-negative association or connection with something just makes it more precious to you over time. And that's kind of partly why older people don't want to change as many things. They just get more attached to what they have. In some sense, attachment is a precursor to seeing it as sacred.
Okay, we can take one last question.
Excuse me. You were talking earlier about how sacrifice or suffering are sort of a necessary part of the sacred. Like even if violence is not, the sacred has to be suffered for in some sense. Like if there's going to be like sacred juice that was mentioned earlier, you have to sweat for that juice in some form. And I was wondering what you thought about, like in society today, it seems like a lot of people would say, well, to eliminate suffering is like a laudable goal. That's one we should be striving for. But at the same time, it seems like, if everything was made totally easy, it would eliminate the sacred, which is also something that people find necessary to life. So like, what are your thoughts on how to negotiate that apparent conflict?
So Robin and I have a podcast, which I should have mentioned before now, but anyway, we have a podcast. It's called Minds Almost Meeting, and it's about us trying to agree and usually disagreeing, though we don't at the meta level agree about how much we disagree, so I think we disagree more than Robin does. Anyway, one of our, did we actually end up doing the paradox of utopia?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we did.
Yes, we
Okay.
did.
So one of our episodes is on the paradox of utopia, which is this thought that throughout history, there have been people who describe utopias. I mean, there's Plato's utopia, there's more, there's lots and lots of utopias. And when people, nowadays, but also, going back into the ancient world, would read about these utopias, like Aristotle reading Plato's Republic, was like, this world sucks, I don't want to live in your utopia, Plato. And nobody ever wants to live in a utopia. And we watch a TV show like The Good Place, right? And it's like, utopia, oh, phew, it's actually the bad place. Like, we're sort of reassured. We don't like utopia. Even when we get to make all the properties of it be the way we want. And there's something puzzling about that. Like, wait, if we want the world to be this good world, and then we're given that good world, and then we're like, no, it's boring. And it occurs to me, we did not say this in our podcast, but it occurs to me that maybe there's somehow no room for the sacred in a utopia. And that's why we're unhappy with it.
I think if you look around, you will see people creating many struggles and higher bars that they invite you to, reach for, that are costly and difficult. That is, as we get rich, people don't just sit back and watch TV, they invent new things to struggle for.
Okay, we will stop there. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming. Come to the one on the 18th on Banshees. That's a Doc Films. And yeah, see you next time. And see if there's cookies left. Please feel free to take as many as you want.